Welcome to Resiliency Within, featuring your host, Elaine Miller-Karas. In unprecedented times, our beliefs and well-being are put to the test. When we take the things we've learned in life and look at challenges in a whole new way, we learn to develop resiliency, which can then be used to promote healing and personal strength. Now, here is Elaine Miller-Karas.
Welcome to the launch of Resiliency Within. I'm so happy to be with you today. I am Elaine Miller-Karas, as was stated, and I want to start out by thanking first Dr. Bryan Robinson, who is my first guest. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about him in just a second, but he's with us now. And we're going to be doing the show a little bit differently because in the beginning, I'm going to be interviewing Bryan. And then the second half of the show, he's going to be interviewing me. So you'll get to know a little bit about me as well. I also would like to say thank you to Robert Cellino, who has been the most wonderful executive producer, and all the people that have helped me in Voice of America to get this show off the ground today. So as we start, I want to give you a little bit of context about what we're going to be talking about. So Resiliency Within, and the byline for this is how we build resilience during unprecedented times. And certainly the last week has not been easy for many of us. And for some of you, you may even feel like maybe it's elusive, but Resiliency Within will be amplifying the message of hope, of healing, and resiliency. And I have been very fortunate to travel around the world during and after natural and human-made disasters. And what I've learned that it is so important to acknowledge the pain and suffering, but also to remember what else is true. And you're going to hear me say this a lot in the show. And what does give us hope, courage, and strength to go on when horrible and difficult things have happened to us in life. I have to say that in the last week, I live in Los Angeles, and I have a dear friend right now who is struggling for life. Her name is Loveland, and she has COVID-19. And I have two other friends, one who lost their husband and one who lost their father to the virus. And then all of the social and political upheaval that we've had, the insurgency, and also maybe many of you say, well, something that I did imagine that could happen. And maybe others of you are saying it is unimaginable. Many of us have been listening to some very, the vitriol of the last few years and worrying that something may happen. But I think the other thing that many of us have had to grapple with is a polarization and also distress within our family systems, that people may be at different political persuasions, and some people want to wear masks and some people don't want to wear masks. And all this has kind of made us all jumbled up. So I'm here today to say, I believe it's important not to ignore pain and suffering. I'm not someone who's like, oh, she's toxically positive, because I do think there's space to acknowledge the pain and suffering, but also to take what I call a resiliency pause. And a resiliency pause, we can integrate into the storms of what happens to us in life. And I want to invite you right now to start thinking about cultivating your resources. So I know that during difficult times, some of you may say, well, what has happened to me? Well, maybe when I've had difficult times in the past, maybe it was my faith, maybe it was my family, maybe it was a walk in nature, but there are things that many of us have been able to pull in and start to use in our lives that have started to make us feel differently. You're going to also hear me talk about something that's not common. I think about 3 portals of information that we talk about: what we think, what we feel, but also what we sense. And so what I'd like to invite you to do for just a few moments is to think right now, what are some of the resources of your life? Who are the people or the places? Maybe some furry creatures. I've got a new puppy in my house that certainly brings me a lot of joy. But I'm wondering if you can just think about maybe one of those things for just a moment. And as you think about one of those things, which I just did, and I took a deeper breath. I don't know if you could hear that, Bryan. He's here with me.
Yeah, I could
And
hear it. Yeah.
yeah, and when that happens, I have this sense of well-being that starts to spread throughout my body. And so those are some of the things that we're going to be talking about. So some of my guests, I have to tell you that I have met so many extraordinary people, some people who are are fairly famous, and some people who are not famous, maybe within their own families and their own communities. But I've learned that if we're going to change and bring more resiliency and well-being, and remember what's true about what unites us, that the people that do that are not only our global leaders, but our natural leaders of communities who come from so many different backgrounds. And so those are some of the folks that are going to be joining me. Bryan Robinson being my first one. I'm almost going to tell you, he's almost going to start talking now. But before I do that, I want to also let you know that we're going to also be talking about resiliency skills. And these resiliency skills are based in neuroscience. And so some of this has to do with what does help us as human beings rebalance, recalibrate our nervous systems when we get bounced out of our better selves. And how can we cultivate that, not only for ourselves, but for our family and our communities, especially during these challenging times. And that's one of the reasons why Bryan Robinson is my very first guest, because, oh man, he is a professor emeritus from the University of North Carolina. He's a psychotherapist. He's an author of over 40 books. I mean, I've written a book, and I'd have to tell you, it took me a long time. It was like having a baby.
It's like digging ditches, yeah.
Yes, it's like digging ditches. So, but his most current book, which I love the title, is called #Chill, Turn Off Your Job and Turn On Your Life. I could say so much more about Bryan, but I'm going to let him start talking right now, because in these times right now, I think his book and his presence and his ideas are so very important to pay attention to. So, Bryan, I'm going to ask you as we get started is, what's on your mind at this present moment?
Well, first thing I want to say to you is congratulations. This is the
Thank
launch of
you.
your radio show, and I'm
I
really
know.
excited for you, and I'm honored to be your first guest. So,
Well, thank you. I think you've done a lot of interviewing of a lot of people. Just so you know, he's also like a writer for Forbes and Psychology Today. And oh my goodness, he's got such a long resume. We'd spend the whole time talking about it if I said the whole thing to you right now, Bryan.
well, there's so much that I want to share about resilience. The one thing that I'm going to start off saying is, we tend to think that things are going to get better, life's going to be smooth, life's a bowl of cherries. But the truth is, life is messy, bumpy, unpredictable. And all you have to do now is switch on your TV or look at your laptop and see what's going on in the world. But the thing is, it's not what happens to us, it's what we do with what happens to us. And I happen to believe that everybody has the ability to be resilient. A lot of people don't know that, but they absolutely do. And I know we're going to talk about a few of those skills, and you'll probably be talking about them throughout the segments that you're doing on your radio show. And I'll be happy to share a little bit of, speaking of life as being bumpy and messy and unpredictable. There's a reason why I've written 40 books. There's a reason why I write for Forbes and Thrive Global and Psychology Today. It's not accidental. So let me start with, I'm probably the only one in earshot right now who grew up in a dysfunctional family. Ha ha.
Yeah, I'm sure there's no one listening here that
no,
grew up
I'm
in
sure
dysfunctional
nobody
family,
but me.
besides me and you. I think
That's
maybe
right.
just the two of us, right? Okay.
That's right.
It's probably one of the reasons why we're doing this right now, Bryan.
Exactly.
Just because that happened to us.
It can be a double-edged sword. For me, it has been, because the traumas that I experienced as a little boy, not only watching my house burn to the ground when I was 5 years old, and being the soldier who had to go out and try to put the fire out at age 5 after playing in my sandbox, but living from day to day in a violent alcoholic home, never knowing when my dad would come home and start tearing up the house. But at a very young age, I instinctively took control.
Mm-hmm.
What I did is I protected my little sister. I got her out of the way. I even learned over the years, as the house was being destroyed and there were furniture breaking fights between my parents, to close the drapes so the neighbors wouldn't see or hear what was going on. Um, Picking up whatnots and knickknacks and lamps. And I had a special hiding place for these objects that became so routine. I was so numb to it, I didn't even know I was being traumatized. And I would put these objects in a certain place as soon as I saw him step out of his 1958 Chevrolet and head toward the house, I knew what was coming. So it became a very routine kind of predictability, even though it was chaotic.
So,
So
Bryan,
yeah,
can I ask you that, when you tell me the story, you were just a little boy,
yeah,
and I had, I think, a similar experience trying to help
mm,
my younger siblings out of danger.
yes.
So what do you think was what happened? What was that little boy
Well,
made of? That kind of grit that helped you survive those
you know,
experiences?
the first words, according to my dear loving grandmother, she was at home when I was born. I was supposed to go to the hospital, but I came early, apparently, according to her. And she said that the umbilical cord was wrapped around my neck. Some people say that's why I'm a little weird today. Uh, but but seriously, she said the first words out of your mother's mouth was, "Please don't let my little baby die."
Mm,
And you know, talk about that those words somehow resonated. That could be symbolic or metaphoric. But
yes.
over the years, I learned that I had to be the little hero. I had to be strong, and I had to take charge to protect not only my mom, but my little sister.
Mhm.
And so uh, I've always been, despite what happened, an eternal optimist.
Yeah.
Still, with what's going on in the world, I'm an optimist, which is really something that's carried me through, you know, the tragedies that I've experienced. I know people have experienced worse, but no matter what we experience, we don't want to minimize our own experiences. We want to validate them and work on overcoming them.
Well,
Um,
and I'm wondering too about that. When I started out by talking about what else is true, this
yeah,
eternal optimist, because I think that I'm probably in that boat too.
yeah,
And when I think about some of the things that you and I've shared, because we've known each other for a while,
hmm,
that we had some difficult things happen. But you mentioned your grandma, and I want
yeah,
to kind of just highlight that for a second, because as we were talking this morning,
hmm,
I was saying, oh, I have this picture behind me, and it's an image that reminds me of my grandma. And
yeah,
then, share with the audience what you
yeah,
were telling me about your grandma. But I think it's important for us to talk about what they both represented to us, because I think that could have been part of what helped us
yeah,
both in our
yeah.
childhoods.
And we call these resources in the work that we do. Uh, I was amazed because I have a beautiful picture of my grandmother on my bedside when she was a young woman. She was a beautiful woman. I didn't know her at that age, but I knew her as an older woman. But she was always a resource for me of calm, nurturing, loving. And on cold nights, we would cuddle up under a blanket and she would
Mm,
tell me stories and say someday I'm going to have a farm and you're going to come live with me, because she knew what I was living through, and we're going to have horses and
yeah.
pigs. And I would say, what else are we going to have? And she would keep going, and then before I knew it, I was asleep. But those are cherished memories that early on gave me a belief that there is another world out there that someday I want to be a part of. Now
Yeah.
I do want to
That
mention,
unconditional love. I mean, it sounds like it's
oh, unconditional, absolutely,
unconditional love. Because
absolutely,
I had a similar grandma, and
yeah.
my grandmother immigrated from El Salvador,
uh,
and we used to call her Abuelita Linda, which is a beautiful grandmother.
ah,
And when I would get to escape to her house too,
yeah,
and what we would do together is we would make lemonade. She had a
ah,
big old lemon tree in her backyard, and we would
mm.
pick lemons off that lemon tree, and she would make the most wonderful, delicious lemonade with too much sugar, which
So
my mother
Elaine, what
probably
do
would
you
not have
notice in
approved of. Oh
what do
my,
you notice inside right now?
oh my goodness, look at that. You're doing the skills with me. I
Yeah,
just feel, oh my goodness, I just feel this great warmth in my
yeah,
body, and
yeah.
I can almost taste the lemonade actually.
That's right.
So
That's
thank you
right.
for inviting me to sense that,
Sure,
Brian. Brian's
sure.
been trained in these resiliency
That's
skills. Isn't
right.
that
Elaine
wonderful?
trained me well.
I sure did. Well, anyway, so go ahead. So
Well,
continue, but I just wanted to kind of point that out.
yeah,
That unconditional love is important, especially when we're growing up with some chaos around
yeah.
us.
That's right. It became routine as a child. Not only these episodes of violence and disruption and unpredictability. There's something called GIA that I have later learned, global high intensity activation, which is when your nervous system is not fully developed as a child and you're bombarded with these kind of traumas. Um, you instinctively have to have something to offset that. And for me, interestingly enough, it was writing. I would go into my bedroom to get away from the craziness, and I would make up these stories, these little kids my age. Um, I was about 10 at that time, and I would get them into trouble and get them out of trouble. And I didn't know it, but now I understand as a psychotherapist, it was my way of controlling an unwieldy life that was chaotic, that I had no control over. And I brought that forward. Writing has been my best friend. It's been my security. It's been my stability. And so that's one of the reasons I suppose I've written 40 books, and I write for Forbes and Psychology Today and Thrive Global. And I'm writing the memoir that I'm talking a little bit about now, because even still, it takes me to a place of serenity and peace and happiness and joy. I love it. Um, the flip side of that, though, is, and Elaine knows this, and this is one of the topics I've written about, I became a relentless workaholic. So the very thing that saved me started to take me down in my adult life as a professor at the university and working in the community and doing research and publishing and advising students and teaching classes. There are no boundaries around that. So that it became a real problem in my personal life. One of the first books I wrote was called Work Addiction, and it's about my life, and it's about what it really is. A lot of people tease about workaholism, but if you look underneath, it's not any different than alcoholism, drug addiction, or food addiction, because it is a stabilizer. It helps you assuage anxiety. It helps you feel in control even when you're not, and you get high from it. Uh, I'm married now, and when we were young and we would go to the beach with friends, my spouse would check my suitcase to make sure I wasn't taking work, because I always did, because the thought of not having my drug was horrifying, to tell you the truth. Now, that may sound strange to people, but when you're a true workaholic, it's like you don't have your bottle, or you don't have your food, or you don't have your heroin if you don't have your work. So after years of this, I learned to sneak work into my jeans or under the spare tire, just like an alcoholic sneaking a drink. So we would get to the beach and everybody would say, "Oh, let's go walk on the beach." And I would stretch and yawn and say, "I think I'm going to take a nap." And everybody thought that was so cool. He's going to actually relax on this vacation. Well, as soon as I saw people out of sight, I pulled out my university project and I worked feverishly, just like an alcoholic sneaking a drink. I call this work infidelity, by the way, which is something I've discovered a lot of workaholics do. And then when I heard them coming back laughing and chatting, I laid down on the bed and pretended I'd been asleep. Now, when I say that, that sounds really sick, because I was sick. I don't work that way anymore. I still do a lot of things, but I'm not driven, I'm drawn. And that's the
Mm.
difference.
Can I
And
ask you a question
sure,
about that?
yes,
Is that we've certainly heard now since COVID that
yes,
many of us are working at home. And I've
yes.
certainly heard more than one person say, well, it's really hard because there's
Mm,
never an end point to the
that's
work.
right.
It's
That's
like I
right.
don't have that office that I'm driving to and then coming back home.
That's right.
So actually saying that it's kind of cultivating an
Yeah.
atmosphere where workaholism can really be part of what's
Yes,
happening
and it
in a greater
blurs the
degree.
lines. And a
Yes.
lot of the research coming out is saying that people are burning out working at home because there's chocolate cake in the fridge, or maybe bourbon. There's laundry that needs to be done. There are children in the other room that need help with school. And so this has become a huge problem. The lines are blurred, and so it's up to each and every one of us to decide what those lines are. One of the things I always say, even before remote working was the norm, if you're working at home, and this is what I do now, you want to make sure you have a special place where you work, not on the kitchen table. If you have I have an office in at the bottom of my home, which is away from everything else. I leave that place just as if I'm leaving my office across town, and I imagine I can't go in there after a certain hour, usually 5 o'clock. and that gives me an automatic boundary. But everybody doesn't have that kind of arrangement. But thinking about at a certain time at the end of the day, we have to set our own boundaries. So it's for each one of us to figure out what those are. Otherwise, we will find ourselves working around the clock and not being able to turn it off. And that's, we lose our sense of balance and our mental
So,
health.
so it's really important to be more mindful of like start times and end
That's right.
times and how much time can you that now go spend with your family. And I know that everyone has the luxury of space where they're living, and I know I've heard these responses as well, saying I don't have any space.
Yeah.
And so one person said creatively to me, but I purchased a screen and I have
Mhm.
a little place in the kitchen and it has a
Yeah.
screen around me. They know not to bother me.
That's right.
And then I pull
That's
that
great.
screen down
Yeah.
and I can now go be with the family in the
Yeah.
part of the house because everybody's in the same area.
Yeah.
So I
That's
think
right.
that we want to be mindful that not everybody has space, but we
That's
can
right.
sometimes try to create that space. Or somebody told me it was
Yeah.
in the bathroom. You know, they go in the bathroom and close the door and they sit
Yeah.
into and they have a chair in the bathtub.
Yeah.
So I thought,
Wow.
well, I mean, people are pretty creative in thinking about
Hmm.
different things that they can do to kind of bring those little moments of those resiliency pauses, because that's what
Yeah.
I think we're talking about too.
That's right. That's right. So, over the years, I wanted to mention something that many of the listeners might know about, and I know you do, Elaine, and it's called a growth mindset. And it's probably one of the most powerful things that I know of that we can do, and that is to think about. We often are hardwired to get carried away with the situation or the incident that brings us misery or unhappiness or fear, and we overlook what's on the inside. And so the whole idea of bringing the resilience tools is what, how can I reframe this situation? For example, I had a man that I worked with many years ago who built skyscrapers, literally. He was a multi-millionaire, maybe a billionaire even. He came storming into my office one day. I can't tell you what he said, but because it's, some people wouldn't want to hear the words, but I said, "What's going on?" And he said, "I have to pay a $500,000 in taxes." Now, I don't usually ask this question, but I could see what the session was going to be about. And I said, "Well, so how much did you make this year?" And he grumbled, 10 or 15 million. This was a rich man living an impoverished life. We all have a choice of what we want to look at and how we want to frame what's happening. You can focus on the thorns or the roses. You can focus on $500,000 in taxes or $10 million in revenue. And almost any situation that we experience, no matter how dire the circumstances, we know this even from Holocaust survivors, that we are in charge of how our life is going to unfold. Life itself, no matter how messy and scary and unpredictable it is not going to determine how I live my life. Now, that's not an easy thing to accomplish, and sometimes it's like swimming upstream, but it's one of the things that I learned, that I am not a victim of what happened to me anymore. I am a survivor, and that changed everything for me. And that's one of the reasons I've been as successful as I have, if you want to call it success. I don't mean that just in terms of career, but I mean in terms of my own mental health. And my own work-life balance that I've been able to create, and my marriage and my friends and my life. So no matter what happens to us, we don't have to live in that place, and we're all, I think, resilient. Basically, we have to just get in touch with it. That's the key.
Oh, that I just love what you just said, because I've heard people sometimes say, I don't know if resilience is possible for me.
Uh,
But I want to say a little bit about neuroscience, and we're going to talk
yeah.
more about this. We're almost time for our break,
Okay.
but that there's a little phrase called brain cells that fire together, wire together.
Yes.
What you
Right.
pay attention to grows. And what you just said is if you cultivate that other part, that it will expand and grow.
That's
So
right.
even if some of you are sitting there saying, I feel pretty hopeless today, I
Yeah.
just want y'all to know that, Bryan and I can attest to our lives to say
Mm.
there's ways that we can pour water on that hopefulness that surrounds us if we start paying more attention to it. So we're going to take a little break. And then when we return, uh, Bryan Robinson is going to interview me now, and I'm going to say, I guess, some things. He's got some questions up his sleeve. And so I just want you all to know that you are listening to Resiliency Within on the Voice America Health and Wellness chapter and channel. And we will be back in just a few moments. And so, Bryan, thank you so much. I think we still have a little bit of time. I'm getting used to these little transitions from talking to having the break and all that kind of good stuff. But it's been so wonderful to hear your stories of resilience. And I was very touched by thinking about you as a little 5-year-old. I think that was one of the first times we met was you telling me that story when you were 5. And I have fond memories and almost felt like I could feel that little 5-year-old and wanted to give you, I probably did give you a hug.
I think you did. Yeah.
I think I did.
That was before COVID. We could hug then.
That's right. I'm looking forward to that. I'm coming to Asheville and I'm going to sit on the back porch and we're going to have a good old fashioned hug.
Can't wait.
So yes. So in any event, I think we're going to go to break and we will be back and we will be talking about a little bit about me, I guess. Not used to doing that, but I guess I'll do that this time. Now
all right, yep, we're clear.
Okay, thank you.
Back in about 2.
Okay, we're clear. Well, so we're still on Facebook, as you know.
Yep.
So I just want y'all, I know you those of you on Facebook, you got to hear a lot of the behind the scenes working with our audio. So I hope you bear with us with that. I don't know if I can go back in there and maybe cut that out a little bit, but
yeah, they get to see us take drinks and put on makeup and do all that good stuff.
Well, Bryan had invited me to speak at the Resiliency 2020 conference. He and Joy Miller, who I have to bring on the show as well. And one of the very important guests, we, kind of were there and she was putting on makeup.
Yes.
And so, we know that this so just so that y'all know that when we all are, no matter who we are, sometimes we're putting on makeup. And I guess you get to see this when we have a little bit of
real life behind the scenes. We get to see
real life behind the scenes. And I think COVID is kind of been part of that as well, hasn't it?
Sure has.
It has. And so also, I just want you all to know that when the show is done, Bryan and I are going to take a look at the Facebook page and see if there's any questions that you have for us too. But also, I'll announce this when we're back on the air. But we do have the possibility of people calling in, and so if people want to do that, they'll be able to call in and ask us questions. And our engineer will let us know if any questions come in. So that will happen as well. I don't know if you need to take a quick break, Bryan. Right now, I'm pretty fine sitting here until
I'm okay. We come back. I had a swig of water, so
I think I'm going to do the same thing, and I'm hoping that anyone who's listening to us on Facebook as well can, if they need to take a little stretch, and we'll come back and talk about what we're going to do next.
All right, we'll have the rejoiner coming back here in about 24 seconds.
Can I ask you a question, Matt?
Sure.
Will you say the number for people to call in? Because I don't have that. I didn't prepare that.
No, I don't come on the mic. I could type it into the messenger for you so you have it.
Oh, could you type it into the messenger and then I can say that when we come back?
Yes, I will.
Okay, thank you. There was one little thing I forgot. And Matt, will you prompt me when we're clear to be back on air again?
All right, I'm going to send the feed your way. Just about to come back.
Okay.
This is Resiliency Within with Elaine Miller-Karas. To reach the show during our live broadcast, please call in to 1-866-472-5792. That's 1-866-472-5792. You may also send an email to elaine@resiliencywithin.com. Now, back to this week's show.
Hello, here we are again. This is Elaine Miller-Karas, Resiliency Within on Voice America. And we are talking to Dr. Bryan Robinson, who's just given us a wonderful background about why resiliency is so important to him. And this is our launch of our show. And so this second part of the show, I'm going to turn it over to Bryan to interview me so that you all will get to know a little bit about what I've been up to over the last number of years of my life, which are getting longer. I have a longer life these days, many years. So go ahead, Bryan, whatever you'd like to ask me, I'll try to answer.
So I think what I'd like to do is start with the present and go back instead of start backwards and come forward. Simply because I think there are a lot of people who are listening right now who have observed what has been going on in our country and in the world, not only the pandemic, but also watching live the insurrection on the Capitol. And you and I were talking briefly about this concept of vicarious trauma. We know people are traumatized as I was, and a lot of people are directly when they experience violence and so forth, abuse. But there's something called vicarious trauma when you observe something through a medium like TV or your devices like laptop or cell phone that you don't expect, and you don't even realize you're being traumatized. So I thought that would be a good place to start, and then we're going to go back. But I'd like for you, Elaine, to talk a little bit about what are some skills that all of us can use today after the show ends that can help us get through these difficult times.
I think one of the most important things I've learned, I want to say that I've created two different models of intervention. One's called the community resiliency model, and the other is the trauma resiliency model. The trauma resilience model is more focused towards psychotherapists, and that's where I first met you, Bryan, because you took our training.
Mm-hmm.
But the community resiliency model is really for the world, and it's a set of 6 very simple wellness skills, and it's about mindful attention to the present moment. And it pays attention. And I actually already introduced you all to a skill, our second skill, which is called building resources. So one of the things that we can do, and I know that I've had to do this many times, is if we're seeing images we're noticing that we're upset, we're feeling distress in our body. Maybe I've heard from a lot of people since last week that they haven't been able to sleep.
Yeah.
So this is knocking us out of what we call our resilient zone or our okay zone.
Mm.
And so we're not in that sense of well-being, we're in a sense of distress. And some of us are like, I'm so angry, I'm yelling and screaming at maybe my family I don't mean to, or some of us like are disconnected. I felt a little depressed actually, and I don't usually feel depressed.
Yeah.
Like going, well, what's happening? But then I remembered what else was true. Because of COVID, I have my daughter and my son-in-law and my granddaughter living with us. And my granddaughter reminds me of what else is true in the world. She's a resource. And when I think about her and I spend time with her, I really pay attention to what's happening in my body. That's the mindful attention. And I notice a deeper breath. I notice even right now as I'm talking about her, I can feel my muscles relax. I can feel not the sense of stress that I felt watching television, for example. So what I've learned, what's important is that if we're so focused on, let's say, watching television right now, that stress can build and get so layered inside of us that we feel like we want to explode.
The saturation.
Or we're going to disconnect. So
right.
What's so important for all of us to remember of what else is true. Actually, it's very similar to the name of your book. There's an app that has been developed through the Trauma Resource Institute, which is a nonprofit, which I co-founded in 2006. And we have this wonderful app, and it's called iChill. And iChill has all these resiliency skills that you can cultivate. If you have a smartphone, you can download the app, you can listen to it. It's completely free. Again, I'm going to say it's iChill. And it's also, we have ichillapp.com if you don't have a smartphone, so you can listen to it on the internet. So I think what's important is that you spend moments for these resiliency pauses and also simple things, sometimes walking, going outside and just feeling your feet as they're hitting the ground and being mindful. Oh, I can sense my feet. In fact, as I'm even talking about it, I kind of stood up and I'm a little straighter because I'm remembering I was walking outside of my backyard this morning and I can sense that breath. So movements are very important. Having a sense of our body in the present moment, we call it grounding, can be a very important thing. But the other thing that I'd like to say to you too is pay attention to those little moments, and they can be small, where you're feeling a little uplifted. And and it doesn't have to be, where I feel uplifted. I know this is going to sound silly, Bryan. I like doing the dishes. I love feeling the water on my hands. I have to do dishes a lot around our
Do
house.
you know when
I
I
also,
feel uplifted?
I
When
feel,
I hear a hammer off in the distance or
oh
a
my
saw,
gosh, look at that.
because somebody's creating, something's being built.
Yes,
It's
exactly.
resilience. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
those little moments is if you can pause and notice the sensations connected to those little moments that you feel a little bit better. And it doesn't have to be like, a huge thing like,
Right.
oh, world peace and how we
Mm,
cultivate world peace. It can be something very small.
that's right.
Um,
Yeah, and what you're really talking about, I'm going to throw a word out here that you and I talk about a lot, that some people may not be familiar with. It's neuroplasticity, that
yes.
we can literally change the neural pathways in our brain by doing these very simple things. They're so simple that it's almost like we don't see the water we're swimming in, but they're powerful. They have a powerful impact on being able to change the trauma and the
Well, and that's when
reactivity.
you were talking about how, about the resiliency that you cultivated
Mm,
in your life in spite of the
that's right.
difficult things.
Yeah.
And just so that you know, neuroplasticity simply means the brain can change.
Yes.
So any of you that may feel despondent or despair, thinking, oh, nothing's ever going to change inside of me, you can shift that. It can change. And I often use a metaphor of a garden. Most of us around the world have gardens, and we might plant some vegetables, maybe some flowers, and we also have weeds. Weeds can be medicinal, but if we only watered the weeds in our garden, what would happen to those wonderful vegetables and flowers? They wouldn't flourish in the same
Mm,
way. And so I think that, weeds are a part of our life. Distress, despair is part of our life. And it's not that we want to ignore that or avoid it, but
yeah.
it's saying, okay, yes, that's true, but also this is true.
Yeah.
And right now in the United States, and those of you that may be listening to us in other parts of the world as well, is that start paying attention, even in small ways, to things that make you feel a little bit better
Mm,
because they tend to grow.
yeah.
But and sometimes you just have to have the experience of it. It's not just what we think,
That's
it's
right.
not just what we feel, but it's
Yeah.
what we sense. It is in our
Yeah.
body. And I often say the body has an elegant design, and that when we pay attention to our well-being, that it just expands. And that's my hope for every single person that's listening to us today,
And
to
so,
have that little spark of hope.
when we learn, and some of this is a learning experience, I think, to look for the opportunity and the difficulty, the solution, instead of focusing just on the problem, look for the upside of a downside situation. After a while, using that term resilient zone, it widens over time as we learn to do that, and it becomes more of an automatic process.
It does. And even though, part of life, it's not that we're going to be in that okay zone or that resilient zone always, that there's going to be times, and I know for me personally, that since COVID-19, there have been times when I've been bumped out of my resilient zone more often. And I tend to go into the high zone rather than the low zone more
Yeah.
often. But
Yeah.
you know what? I know how to get back in.
Yeah.
I don't have to stay out there. I can sense the well-being. I can go for a walk. I can think about my resources. I really think that this whole aspect of sensing what's happening on the inside. And if I sense distress, is there something that I can think about that might help me sense some well-being, that I don't have to be in that track of only sensing the despair,
Yeah.
that something else can be true inside of me. And I think what I often say when I do trainings is, one of the most important things I've learned as I've traveled around the world is when we can learn to tell the difference between sensations of distress and well-being, something starts to emerge, which is a choice of what we're going to pay attention to. You and I couldn't change the fact that we had families that had suffering and struggles in them,
Mm,
and that we were impacted as a result of it. But what if we could learn, even if we're living in difficult situations like many of us are living right now, well, maybe when I go into a certain part of my house or I go into the backyard, I can pay attention, like you said, to that sound of the hammer in the distance.
yeah.
And all of a sudden, I can have a little moment of that resiliency pause
Mm,
where I can feel better. Because guess what? One resiliency pause can have another one and another one. And then those can start to
it builds.
also grow
Yeah.
and
That's right.
expand. And I think that, it's so funny because we've never talked about this. We've talked many times, Bryan, but we've never talked about this shared optimism we have,
Mm, mm,
which has kind of when I think about what's happened to me from the suffering I've had in my life,
Mhm.
that there's this optimism that has also grown out of what's happened to me, similar
Well,
to you.
that brings up then the question, like the other question I want to ask you, and that is, tell us a little bit about those early years and how that's contributed to where you are today.
Well, I think it's similar to what you said. My dad was an alcoholic, although I have to say that he also got recovery. In the
Oh,
last year of his life, he was a very grateful member of Alcoholics Anonymous. But I think what I learned from my childhood was that that something else was true, that I had that escape to my grandma's house, but also that I think that what I learned was I was also could be really good in a crisis. So what did I do? I became a social worker. And where did I love to work? I loved to work in hospitals, which were one crisis after another. But I found that I could have this very much an equilibrium and a calm when everything was
that's
chaotic,
right. Yeah.
chaos
Yeah.
around people. So that was, I felt, was a gift. So instead of, like you said, instead of saying, oh, I was victimized by that, oh my goodness, I survived that. Not only did I survive that, but I took something out of that, the difficulties of my childhood.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I've thrived as a result of
Yeah.
it. And that I've been able to, through the Trauma Resource Institute and through the models I've created, is really take this all over the world. Like we've taken the models, not only the Trauma Resource Institute, but collaborators with us. We've taken it to over 100 countries around the world because we all have a nervous system that is designed in a very similar way. And when
Elegantly
we start to
designed. Yeah.
elegantly designed, that whether I've gone to Africa and I'm in Tanzania, or I'm in parts of Northern Ireland, or if I'm in China, we are designed the same way. I have learned to respect our differences and our different cultures that have been so have enlivened me and given me more vitality. But then I say, what do we have in common? What unifies us? And I think right now in our world, what unifies us? What can we come together that we can agree on? And if we are in that resilient zone, if we're in that space of our well-being, what I've also seen all over the world, which has been so exciting, is that self-compassion grows. How many times, if we've grown up in difficult situations, have we said, oh, I've got to do this better? Or if I just work harder, if I write one more book, maybe I'll be loved. Those kinds of things that
Yes.
we can say, if I do one more training, maybe. But if
Yeah.
we start to cultivate this and to know that from the difficulties of our life, something else has happened. And so, survivors and thrivers can come out of adversity,
You
is
know,
what I've learned.
as you're talking, I'm suddenly remembering Mr. Rogers, and I remember, when Reagan was shot, the attempted assassination, it was shown over and over and over on the media, and people were traumatized by it. But what Mr. Rogers did is, for the children, he said, look at the people who are helping the president. He really focused on it's. He didn't water the weeds; he watered the flowers, as to use your
Yes.
metaphor. And that's something we can all do. It's not about putting our head in the sand, but it's all just bringing what you and I would call the parasympathetic nervous system to balance out the sympathetic nervous system, which is fight or flight. And we can do that on a simple, basis if we're stuck in traffic and in a hurry to get somewhere, or in a major catastrophe, is to know that's where our power is to be able to do that. And we're equally designed for that, just as we are to respond to a crisis in a positive or negative way. So I like your metaphor of watering the weeds instead of watering the flowers. We do it automatically because we have a built-in negativity bias that Mother Nature gave us to survive. And once we realize we can change that with our widening our resilience zone, we can focus on other things, and that power grows as we learn to do that.
Right. And I think that's what, I think of anything that we leave, when we're talking about, what we really want resiliency within to be about, is how we can cultivate that. And I think some of the guests that will be coming, for example, next week, there was a veteran of the Iraq War who was suicidal, who had written her suicide note, was ready to go. And she discovered that she could start cultivating her resilience, and it made a huge difference in her life. And so how can we, for those of you that may be feeling despair, how can we start to cultivate more of that resilience that can maybe shift that, again, that suffering that we're experiencing, not to not say that it's there, but to, again, I know it sounds like a redundancy, but what else is true?
Mhm.
What else is true?
Mhm. Wow. So
Yes, here
this
we
is,
are.
yeah, this has been a wonderful experience to be with you and to talk about some of this, especially given what's going on in the country right now. And just to remind everybody that we're probably going to be seeing these reruns and the saturation on the media, but we can turn off the TV. We can listen to soft music. There are other things we can do. And we can also, as you said, monitor what's going on inside of us. One of the simplest things that I do for myself and with clients is ask folks, and some people might want to do this after the show, take 1 minute, just 60 seconds, and just sit and listen to as many different sounds as you can. And then after you've done that, don't try to memorize the sounds. Just focus on as many different ones. It could be your gurgling stomach, ambient noise outside, like a traffic or airplane, a heating system. And as you do that, just notice after a minute what's going on the inside. And I'm
And
not going
things
to,
shift, don't they, Bryan?
oh,
Because
yes. In
basically,
1 minute, in
in
1 minute.
1 minute,
And if you can do that in a minute, imagine what 5 minutes or 10 minutes.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so, what you've just described is one of what we call in the community resiliency model a help now strategy or a reset now strategy. There's actually 10 of them that we've put together, but there could be much more. But one of them is paying attention to the sounds,
Mm-hmm.
but it also could be also pay attention to the temperature in the room.
Yeah.
Is it cool? Is it warm? It could be counting backwards from 10.
Uh-huh.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6. Sometimes that can all of a sudden help settle you a little bit. It can be sometimes for me, if you're feeling a lot of energy, and I actually use this a lot with kids, is pushing against the wall with your hands and
Yeah.
pushing against with force a little bit.
Yeah.
And you can feel some of that energy leaving you.
Yeah, you can.
So
I
that
love that one.
and
If
have
you
you
can,
have you used that one too, Bryan?
I
Because it's
do the
something.
wall. Yeah.
Yes, yes, I've had to
Yeah.
use that a little bit these last week. Okay, get
Yeah,
this energy
absolutely.
out of my body, but it doesn't have to be fancy. Some of the
Mhm.
strategies, right?
And it
It could
brings
be
us
as
into the
simple.
present moment. Uh,
Exactly.
and our brain wants to go into the future, worry, to get ready for what's going to happen next, or regrets of the past. And it's really training our brain to stay in the here and now. And that's where our peace and serenity and calm and clarity reside.
And as you're saying that, when we're in that present moment, we're not thinking out there in the future and we're not
That's right.
thinking out there in the
That's
past. We're
right.
right here.
Yeah.
Like right now, all of us have this moment together
Yeah.
as we're talking. And as we're talking about these ways that we might be able to restore that equilibrium inside of us.
That's right.
As we only have a few minutes left, one of the things I wanted to ask you, and maybe I can share this too, because we talk about resiliency. And, I asked many people this question. When I was in Northern Ireland not long ago, we were starting a resiliency training, and one of the people came up to me and said, "Well, we have this big a billboard in our neighborhood, and it says if anybody calls you resilient, run the other way. It's just the government trying not to give us the services that we deserve." So resilience, for some people, can
Wow.
necessarily not be a positive word. It
That's
could be a
interesting.
dirty
Yeah.
word. So I think it's important that maybe on this first show, I'm going to give you my definition. I've had many definitions of resiliency, and if you put it into Google, for example, I think they come up with thousands of
Mm-hmm.
definitions. But I'm going to ask you in a minute what your definition is, Bryan. But mine is resiliency is the human capacity to lean into individual and collective strengths with compassion and grit when faced with the challenges of our lived experience. So that when I talk about resiliency within, that's what I'm talking about in this show. So how about you, Bryan? What is your definition of resiliency?
One way I would describe it is stick-to-itiveness, because I have this part, as many people do, this little voice in my head that says, you can't do that. Uh, and I know I can. And so I talk to that little voice and say, I know you think I can't do it, and that's okay. You can think that, but just watch, because I'm here now. And when I say to that part of me, I'm here now, I'm talking about the Bryan Robinson who is of a certain age, who's grown, who's smart, who understands the world. And I'm speaking to that little boy who didn't know what to do and was trying to figure everything out on his own without adult guidance. Well, I'm here now and I can do this for him. And that gets me through stick to itiveness. And I know uh, he doesn't know, but I know that I can pretty much do whatever I set my mind to do.
Yeah.
The
And I
other thing
think,
I would say
yeah.
about that too, that I've learned when something happens that's unpleasant or that I didn't want to happen or it's unexpected, is to ask myself, how is this happening for me, not to me? I'm not a victim. So how can I turn this inside out and look at it as a learning experience? And how can I grow from this?
So that gives you some distance from it, doesn't it? It's not
It
like
gives
it's on your
me
lap and it's not, you wouldn't become
it
so
gives me the
defensive
wide
about
angle
something.
lens. It gives me the wide
Right.
angle lens. Yeah, the big
Right.
picture.
And that wide lens, I think right now
Yeah.
is really important. When I think about the United States of America and think that we've been around for a long time
Yes,
and we've had a pretty strong democracy,
that's
I
right.
think, okay, yes, we're having difficulties now, but we've also had stick to itness, to use your
Yeah, stick to
term,
itiveness.
Bryan. Yes.
And you know what? I learned that from Erin Brockovich. If you know the movie Erin Brockovich,
Yes, I do.
she is the epitome of stick to itiveness, and that's a word her parents taught her when she was young to get through hard times. And I think it's a great way to talk about resilience. But you're right, our history, I think, you know what's happening is we're going to see our nation and our democracy strengthened by what we're seeing right now. I really believe that.
And you and I are very optimistic, and I
Yep,
believe the same thing, even though we know that the suffering is not over
that's right.
and that we have more that we are going to be having to go
Yes,
through.
that's
But
right.
I'm hoping that all of you that have been listening to us in this hour can remember, I guess, the optimism that we both have,
Mm.
and to remember that what else is true as you go through your week. And I also want to thank you so much. They're telling me we only have a few minutes left, Bryan, is that I just thank you so much, my friend, for coming on this launch of the show. Your wisdom has been something that has inspired me, which you have advised me in the past. And I thank goodness that I came across you in my journey of life.
Uh,
So I know this is not our last conversation
oh
that we'll
no,
ever have.
you and I have a mutual admiration society
Yes, we
together. I feel the
do.
same way about you.
Well, and I
And
want to remind people too,
yeah,
can you tell people how they can get a hold of your book?
oh sure.
Yes,
The
please.
book is available in bookstores everywhere, Amazon.com. Um, And on my website, bryanrobinsonbooks.com, that's Bryan, robinsonbooks.com, you can actually go on and take the chill test. It'll tell you how chill you are or are not, and it'll score it automatically electronically for you. And you can read some of my columns from Forbes and Psychology Today. All that's free. And it gives you more information about the work I'm doing and where I'm going to be in the future. So,
So, Bryan, thank you so much. And thank you all for listening to our very first show. And again, I want to remind you that this is Resiliency Within. My name is Elaine Miller-Karas. And please remember what else is true during this, what I think is probably going to be a tough week for some of us. Remember what else is true and devote some time to your resiliency. So thank you so much for being with us and having this time together. And Bryan, I'm gonna invite you to come back again if I get to do more of these
oh,
shows,
I'd love
because
to.
I think we have a much more to talk about in
Oh,
the future
yes.
as well. So
Absolutely.
I'm looking forward to that as well.
Great.
So thank you all, and I will see you next time, which is the 18th at 1 p.m. And we will have a wonderful guest who will talk to us about her resiliency and how she's gotten through some very difficult times. So thank you all for coming.
And we're all clear. Great job today. Good show.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right. And we're still live on Facebook.
Oh,
So I'm just going to see. I mean, if there's anything, Bryan, anything more you want to say on Facebook, I'm going to try to bring it up right now as we're talking, spending these last moments together.
well, one of the things I didn't mention this, but I could come back some other time. And I have a new book called it's not out yet, but it's called The Lizard Brain Survival Guide, and the lizard brain is just the base part of our brain. The survival brain is another word for it. That's very quick, very fast. And I was watching, there's a Netflix documentary on Shawn Mendes, and some of you may know him, some not. If you're a young female, you will definitely know him. He's a heartthrob, has a beautiful voice. He fills arenas all over the world. And the first thing on the documentary, he steps up to the microphone, and the place is sold out. I think 50,000 people, and he's talking, and he says, when I step up to the microphone, the ego rushes in. He's talking about the lizard brain, and it tells me, hey, you are the man. You've got to be perfect. This has got to be right. They're depending on you. And he said, my first note is always flat, always. But he said, then once I start relaxing and just reminding myself, hey, I'm just a guy who loves music, and I'm here just to enjoy the music, all of a sudden I'd knock it out of the park,
Wow.
because the lizard brain recedes. And now that's the opening in my book, but that we can apply that to any stage we're on. We're all on a stage in one way or another, whether you're a parent or it's your job or a volunteer or whatever it is. And we have the ability to live from what I call the C spot, from calm, compassion, courage, creativity, curiosity.
It
Uh,
sounds like the C spot is very similar to our resilient
it
zone.
is.
Yes.
It's very
So
similar.
that
There's
place that
also called the self. There are
yes.
different names for it. But it brings the neuroscience, the microbiology, the psychology all together. We have different names, but it is all the same thing. And that's what that's what we've really been talking about, is living from that centered place.
Right. And also to know that we can live by that centered space, but it doesn't mean that we're always there.
That's right.
I think the
We'll get
really
knocked out of it,
we get
bumped
knocked out of it, that we
Yeah.
can get, and I think what you and I've been cultivating in the work that we've been doing through our professional lives is, how do we get back into that resilient
That's
zone when we
right.
get knocked out? Because we've been knocked out before. And so how do
Oh,
we get
yes.
back in again?
Oh, yeah.
Well, Bryan, I think that maybe we should come to a close today. I'm going to say goodbye to our Facebook friends. I'm going to ask you to stay on a little bit longer on our Zoom call before we
Okay.
end. And thank you so much for being here for the launch of our first show. And we will see you next week. And please put your comments, and I'll try to take a look at them. If there's any comments or questions that I can answer, I will certainly try to do that. So thank you so much for joining us, for joining Bryan and I today. Thank you. Okay, so let's see if I can do this. Oh, okay.